Hi, so in this video, I just want to talk a little bit more about how we can take some of the ideas from Sherry Turkle's work and apply them to developing our own skills in the field of autoethnography. Now, you'll recall that Sherry Turkle did a couple of things that were worthy of note. Firstly, she came up with this argument that computers had really affected how we think about the mind and how we think about the self. So, computers had really impacted how we understand who we are. But also, she'd come to this conclusion by collecting 400 stories about very personal encounters with computers. So her theory about the self was very much based on stories about the self. And this is the root of a method known as autoethnography, which we can explore in relation to the methodological reading from this week from Deborah Reed Dennehy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do three things. I'm going to talk a little bit about what autoethnography is. I'm going to talk about how it applies to media research. And then the last thing is I'm going to relate all of that to the tutorial exercise that I would like you to do this week. So what is autoethnography? So autoethnography, I really like the piece by Reed Dennehy because she talks about how autoethnography really entails two different kinds of research, which are related to but quite different from the notion, a word that you might be more familiar with, which is autobiography. So if we talk about an autobiography, we know exactly what we mean, right? It's a story, it's somebody's story. Now, in autoethnography, it's a little bit different because what autoethnography is about using personal experiences to kind of explain how the perspective of the self can be used to reflect on wider social realities. And in ethnography, this is particularly related to the idea of talking about how rules function in cultures. So most of us live in social settings that are in some way rules based. What do I mean by this? Well, you go to a bar, you go to a gym, you go to a concert. What do all these things have in common? They're places where you meet others who are strangers who you don't know, and yet you kind of get along with them. You know how to behave around them, even though you're not communicating in any direct sense quite often. And that's because social settings are governed by rules that we kind of pick up along the way. We don't really know how we do it, but we just kind of do, and society works because of that. And ethnography is really a way of researching how those rules are generated and how they work. And this is really important because this is the basis of the idea that communication actively creates social reality. Now, there are two ways that we can use the notion of the self to explore this. The first is that we can use our experiences as members of a particular culture to explain to people who aren't members of that culture how those cultures work, how they make sense to other people who might not think they make a lot of sense at all. And I'm going to be talking about some examples of that in a couple of seconds. And I'm going to be applying that to the tutorial exercise from this week. The second way that we can talk about autoethnography is to think about the role of the researcher. And the reality is that as media researchers, we're never entirely outside of the cultures that we're researching. But nevertheless, sometimes we might see particular things that particular groups of people are doing with media and thinking, wow, I just don't understand that. That's pretty strange. And in that sense, what we can do is we can be honest about what are our own media experiences, what are we bringing to the research that we do, and think about that as a way of asking the right questions about how these cultures work. So this looks strange to me. Why does it look strange to me? And if I ask the people who are inside those cultures, what would they say about what they're doing? How does it make sense to them? So really what this is all about is about thinking about how your media experiences affect the kind of media research that you're likely to do. But let's think a little bit more about how this relates to media research particularly. This dude over here is what's called a brony. He is a grown man who likes to dress up like My Little Pony and hang out with other people who are like minded men who like to do the same thing. And this is an example of the sort of culture, the sort of media culture that people explore. And why do I talk about this? Well, I talk about this because I was asked about this phenomenon a few years ago. And I looked at it and I thought, huh, that's a little strange. I don't know what that's about. Now, if you talk to people who participate in this culture, it actually makes absolute sense to them. So, for example, some people who participate in, some people who are bronies are fathers. And being a fan of My Little Pony gives them a chance to spend quality time with their daughters. Now, let's get over this, okay? I mean, we know that some of the best times you'll ever have are watching movies, watching telly, with your friends or with your family, because these are social moments. You're sharing ideas, you're having a laugh, you're enjoying each other's company, and this is really, really, really important. So there's an important bonding function for a lot of these men. But it's more than that. It's quite often that when you're sitting there watching My Little Pony, it gives you a chance to talk about really important things like feelings, friendship, those sorts of things. Gender is another big thing. So actually, for a lot of these guys, being inside this brony culture is an important part of being a father. So what this tells us is that there's very much a value again in how has this research been done. It's being done by going inside these cultures and looking in quite close detail at the lives of the people who participate with them and talking about their autobiographies and trying to make sense of how their media use reflects where they are in society. So how can we apply this to the exercises I've asked you to do this week? So in the tutorial this week, I'm going to ask you to reflect on the data that we've all generated around how we've been using media recently, particularly within the social circumstances created around the coronavirus, or COVID-19, as I think we're calling it today. So what I want you to do is practice thinking about these kind of insider, outsider perspectives in doing research. And I want you to do two things. I want you to read through the responses. And before you come to class, I want you to pick two. I want you to pick one that makes complete sense to you, one that resonates with you, a person who's written about how they've been using media, how they've been feeling about things in relation to media. You look at it and you go, I know exactly what you mean. Then, if you can, I want you to try and pick another one where there's an explanation of media use that seems just unusual to you, that you'd never have thought of, that seems odd, that doesn't make sense to you. And I want you to think about, why does it seem so unusual to you? Then I want you to bring your examples into class. And what we're going to be doing in groups is talking about the examples that we've all found. And then as a group, what you're going to do is you're going to pick one case study that you think says the most about how media have a general impact on social reality. So the individual story that speaks most directly to general themes when we're thinking about how media work in the social world. Okay, I want you to do that. And then the last thing I want you to do is I want you to think about, how does your particular story, the story you've picked as a group, how does that reflect the idea that media affect a sense of the self? Now, why am I asking you to do this? Well, I'm asking you to do this because it's going to give you practice with a method that you might find really useful for your project. And secondly, in terms of presenting data and arguing for the significance, the validity of that data, this is exactly what you're going to need to do. This is exactly the skill that you're going to need for your final paper. So that's what I'm going to ask you to do. That's why we're doing it. And I'll see you in class.